Hello, I'm David Hill, Global Technologist in the Product Strategy Group at Veeam. In the interest of time, I'm going to fly through these slides because I want to be able to show everyone some really cool demos around what we can do with Kubernetes backup and also a sneak peek into some roadmap items as well. So let's get started. So October 6, 2020 was an exciting day for Veeam, exciting day for me as well. Veeam announced that it acquired Kasten. Now, Kasten is the market leader for Kubernetes backup and disaster recovery. And for anyone who kind of can cast their mind back about an hour and a half ago when Rick was asking people what their perception of Veeam was, and somebody was talking about how Veeam has grown into this enterprise data management company, this is exactly the direction that Veeam's going in with this Kasten acquisition. So why Kasten? Well, Kasten and Veeam have been in partnership for quite some time, around about 2 years, where we've been working together as a partnership because we have these 4 key synergies. And that's where Veeam protects multiple workloads, whether it's on-prem, on a physical machine, virtual machine, or out in the public cloud, across all these different multiple environments. If you think about Veeam being able to protect vSphere, Hyper-V, Nutanix, AIX, Windows, Linux, all these different environments, regardless of their locations, and then all these different data services like SQL and Oracle and things like that. Kasten had exactly the same pillars and use cases and synergies. So it made a simple fit for Veeam and Kasten to come together to essentially expand the capabilities in this newfangled Kubernetes cloud native world that we all seem to find ourselves in. So Kasten provides data protection and mobility for Kubernetes workloads. So you'll see a lot of the similarities between Veeam backup and replication when we're talking about backup and recovery, application mobility, and disaster recovery. You just saw a lot from Melissa around disaster recovery. You've seen in the past at Tech Field Days and Cloud Field Days, the capabilities Veeam has with application mobility. And then, of course, the main critical one, backup and recovery. So Kasten provides all these capabilities natively for Kubernetes. It drives a lot around application discovery. So I'm going to show you in a couple of slides about some of the concepts around applications in Kubernetes and how that works. But building out on this around policy-driven automation, whether you're an operator of Kubernetes or you're a developer using Kubernetes to deploy applications on there. So when we look at Kubernetes, the Kasten platform has been built from the ground up native for Kubernetes. It's not being shoehorned in. It's not trying to be something it's not. It's just being built natively to integrate and work with the Kubernetes platform. So we see here an example of the K10 platform deployed in AWS across the EKS, so the Elastic Kubernetes service. And I'm going to show you some of this in a demo, but leveraging things like identity and access management in AWS, leveraging things like EBS snapshots and volumes and scaling out across these availability zones as well. So when we think of Kubernetes and we think of what Kubernetes does, typically Kubernetes, the first thing that comes to mind is a container orchestrator. And how do we build this out? And when you look at Kubernetes, yes, it's very good at just doing that container orchestration. That's exactly what it's meant to do. Deploy pods as and when it's needed, scale them out, scale them down, respawn them when they need to be, when they've been destroyed, things like that. But what makes up a container application is more than just a single container. There can be multiple containers. We have things like configuration maps and secrets and certificates and different services like load balancers that are all deployed that make up an actual application. Kasten treats this Kubernetes application as this single operational unit, and you'll see this in the demo. But it's very similar to thinking about how when you protect an application in the vSphere world, you don't just go and back up a single VM. You know, if you think about like a standard 3-tier web application, you have a web server running on a VM, you have a middleware server, and you have a database server as the back end. That makes up an application in the vSphere world and the physical world, whatever kind of Windows world or Linux world we're living in. It's the same with containers. We have all these different services and capabilities that we use that we need to protect. It's not just a case of protecting a single container or a single data lake or something like that. So Kasten has taken a unique approach to this. They focused on it from an operations perspective and also a developer perspective. So what you see is when we look at Kasten, being able to not only provide the capabilities that the operators need from a day-to operations perspective, you know, compliance management, policy-based automation, and also global visibility. Developers need those same capabilities as well, but they also need to make sure that they don't change their tool sets. So if you think about what a developer does, certainly in the Kubernetes world, he'll just write a script, he'll write some YAML code, some JSON, push his applications out to the Kubernetes platform, and it will go and deploy them. From an operator's perspective, that's quite a headache because they don't know what's getting deployed, they don't know when it's going to be ran, how are they going to protect it, will it meet the compliance requirements that they have for a business. So being able to integrate and essentially span these two personas is what Kasten does very well. Now, when we look at Kasten, they have a number of integration points. Kubernetes is obviously the core to everything they do, but for anyone who's familiar with Kubernetes, we've seen this massive explosion of what's going on in the Kubernetes world, whether it's the Google Kubernetes engine, Amazon EKS, Azure AKS, you know, OpenShift from Red Hat, Pivotal, Rancher. vSphere now has integrated containers with vSphere 7. Spanning all these is getting quite complex. And then, of course, we have all the storage infrastructure, much in the same way that Veeam supports all these different storage vendors. Kasten does the same, whether it's AWS S3 or S3 compatible, NetApp, Pure Storage, Dell EMC. All these different capabilities can integrate natively with Kasten, and we have support for all those. So when we look at the Kasten platform, we have all these different capabilities, and I'm not going to go into all these because, frankly, you just get bored listening to me reading out all these on a slide. But pick a few things out. Integration with Kubernetes and being able to leverage things like snapshots, whether it's an EBS snapshot out in Amazon, whether it's leveraging snapshots on a physical environment that's running on-prem. End-to-end encryption, key one when you think about taking your data and moving it out and moving it around. Now with Kasten, we launched version 3 quite recently. And when we look at how quickly Veeam is iterating, you know, I was talking at the beginning of Tech Field Day around how we're now on version 3 of Veeam backup for AWS. Kasten is taking the same innovation and deployment approach of new capabilities and new features very quickly. Things change a lot in the cloud native world. Anybody who watched reInvent recently, although it's still going on, I think it's like a 3-week conference, they'll have seen in the keynotes all the new features and capabilities that Amazon has just released in AWS. Then you've got Azure on top of that, Google Cloud as well. All these different capabilities are all changing very dramatically and very quickly. So with version 3, 2 key areas that have been included in that is multi-cluster support. So as people scale out their Kubernetes clusters, being able to manage that from a single interface is critical. And then, of course, multi-tenancy as well. So from a Kasten perspective, this multi-cluster dashboard shows you how many clusters you have, how many policies you have spanned across that, all your applications. So you don't have to do a lot of console hopping. You know, it's always the utopia of we've been speaking about it at Tech Field Day for years, about the single pane of glass. Everyone talks about how we're building a single pane of glass. I was talking about a single pane of glass 10 years ago when I worked at VMware. We're all still trying to get there. But with this multi-cluster dashboard, that certainly brings that to fruition. So looking at Kasten, how does it work? And this is what I'm going to show you in the demonstration. Well, we have our container platform, whether that's running on virtual or physical or out in the public cloud. And we have these applications that get moved into the Kubernetes platforms. A lot of the capabilities around moving to Kubernetes is being able to leverage just the orchestrator APIs, discover applications, perform lifecycle operations, and build that out. And as we go through, what you'll see with Kasten is the ability to leverage those infrastructure APIs. So not worrying about having to leverage a proprietary storage layer. They can support the block storage providers regardless, and then also leverage object storage for offloading those backups out to offsite locations as well. So in my demo, what I'm going to show you is essentially we're going to start with a single Kubernetes cluster, and that one's actually running in Amazon on their Elastic Kubernetes service. And then we're going to span that out and scale it out. And what you'll see is I'll show you how simple it is to migrate workloads to other clusters. So I'm actually going to show in the demo how we migrate over to Azure AKS, the Azure Kubernetes service. There's lots of EKSs and AKSs and KSs everywhere. But it's really simple. But every Kubernetes deployment has subtle differences. So things like storage classes, which is a big capability when you're moving from cloud providers. And I'll show how we can manage that very easily in the demo as well. So I want to finish the presentation and just very quickly show you a roadmap piece about where we're going with Veeam and Kasten. So Kasten backs up its Kubernetes workloads. And then, as I mentioned, we can offload those out to object storage or NFS for like offsite data storage, things like that. Now, with vSphere 7 bringing in Kubernetes integration and container integration into its platform, we're actually going to integrate the Kasten platform to leverage the Veeam backup and recovery backup repositories. So when we look at this, and I said Veeam backup and recovery because we were talking about this the other day, and it's actually Veeam backup and replication. I will correct myself live on air. It's because I read the recovery on the screen. But when we're looking at this, being able to leverage the Veeam backup and replication server backup repositories gives us a lot of capabilities. And you'll see in one of the demos that we can leverage this to do things like what the plan is to do instant recovery to vSphere into Kubernetes, things like that. So we've shown lots of times at Tech Field Day our instant VM recovery to vSphere, how we can just right-click, automatically, instantly stream from object storage and have a VM up and running instantly on vSphere as a vSphere VM, as an example. We'll be able to bring that same instant recovery goodness to the Kubernetes world, leveraging the Veeam backup and replication, backup repositories, and integrating with the Kasten platform.
So you mean doing that from a Tanzu perspective, or more or less refactoring the application?
Yeah, so it will be integrating with Tanzu, so the vSphere native integrated containers. So yeah, the Tanzu integration, leveraging the storage and how we do that. So
okay, yeah. Good, thank you.
So the first thing I want to point out is how easy it is to install Kasten. Once you have a Kubernetes cluster, you just run a Helm command. This is showing you how you do it on AWS. Kasten has fantastic documentation on how you can deploy it on all the different platforms. As soon as you deploy it, you're presented with a dashboard that shows you what's going on in your environment. The first thing you have to do is just set up a profile. What am I going to use as my external storage? So you create a profile here. You can pick Google, Object Storage, Azure, S3 compatible, and so on. Once we have that in place, we have our applications, and they're automatically discovered. So I deployed earlier a WordPress appliance, which is running over here out in Amazon. This is obviously my EKS platform. And I just automatically discover this application, and I can create a policy. So I'm going to call this TFD22 backup. And I have some options. Do I want to use Kubernetes snapshots for my backups? How often do I want to do them? Do I want to export these via snapshot exports out to my storage profiles, whatever I have? I can do lots of things around names, and I'll go into that a bit later. And then I just create a backup policy. Really straightforward, and I can run that. And that will actually start taking a backup of that workload. And we'll see in the dashboard shortly that it'll pop up and it'll start saying we're doing a backup. So there we are. Once the backup's finished, it will then start doing an export. So it will actually take those snapshots, offload those out to object storage. Now, if I want to restore or migrate to another cluster or a different environment, if I go to my policies, and here's my TFD22 backup, we have this little button at the bottom called Show Import Details. And it presents me with this bit of code. So I copy that to the clipboard. And if I go over to my other environment, and I've changed the color so we can see that it's a different one, this one's running in the Azure Kubernetes service. So I want to set up a new policy in this environment, but I want to do an import. So if I just say I want to do TFD22 and say import, that code that I just copied, I simply paste into this box. I already have my profile set up, so it knows it's there. And how often do I want to do the import? So I'll say I want to do this hourly, whatever. And I just say create policy. Once this backup's finished over here, and we're doing the export, as we can see, we're still going on, that will actually export that, and the K10 platform on the other cluster will just automatically import those restore points. So we can see here, I've done a few before where we've done some imports and the restore points are already there. So if I go to my applications, what we'll see is if I filter by status and go to removed, I have some restore points that aren't actually associated with any namespaces or running in that cluster. So I can simply pick those and I'll say, right, okay, I want to restore this restore point. Now, as I mentioned, we were talking about storage classes. And if I look at my AWS environment here, I have this storage class of GP2 running in my EKS environment. So if I run the same command in Azure when it loads, look at the storage classes, we'll see that Azure has different ones. So what I want to be able to do is, we see we have like Azure File, Premium, Default. I'm going to use this default one. So when I'm performing a restore, the first thing I need to do is say I want to create a new namespace. And I need to say that by looking at my different components down here, we see that I have this storage class of GP2. So if you remember in the slides, I showed you like a diagram of what makes up an application. Well, we have all these different components that Kasten protects and backs up. So the storage class I need to change. So we have this ability here to say apply transforms to restored resources. So I want to add a new transform. So I'm going to give this a storage and display name of storage class. And then I have these ability to pick these different resources. So I need to change my persistent volume claims, which is going to allow me to change those different storage classes. If I pick a new operation, I can perform all these different operations on these different resources that I've picked here. So I'll simply say I want to replace one. And what's really great is we get these examples as well. So it kind of points out that these JSON pointers, what we want to do, gives us some examples. So this example here is exactly what I want to do. So I'm just going to copy and paste that one. And I know that the storage class I want to change to is called default because it's over here. So I simply say, right, okay, now I want to make sure that this works. So I click test operation, pick what I want to change. So I'm going to say I want to check my persistent volume claims. It loads the JSON and we see that we have GP2 here. We click the button and if I scroll down, we now see that it has default. So we're successfully changing that. And I know that works because if I try and do something else, I get an error that tells me it's not a match. So I know what I'm creating is going to work. So I'll add that as an operation and I'll simply say create transform. All I need to do now is click the restore button and it will go away and it will start to perform a restore from that restore point, import that backup, deploy that application into Kubernetes, also start creating all the services, so load balancers and those kind of things, and it will just simply go and do the restore. So very simple, very easy to just migrate and restore across clusters. So while that's running, I'm going to switch to, unfortunately, a recorded demo. I know everyone likes live, but we only have this as a recording, and show you that Veeam backup and replication integration. So what we see here is the locations that I was talking about earlier. And we'll see here that I have the Veeam backup server as a location in Kasten as well. So I simply pick Veeam backup server. This will allow me to enter the details for my Veeam backup server. So I'll give it a name, just call it VBR target, pick the Veeam backup server, the IP address of that VBR server, what is the backup repository that I'm going to use, and a username and password for that VBR server. Once we enter those credentials, it will simply create a new profile and have that VBR target and give it the capabilities to actually leverage that to offload snapshots to, much in the same way I showed in the demo we were doing with S3 object storage. Now, if I go to the dashboard, I can now go and configure a backup policy to leverage that backup target that we created. So just in the same way you saw me do in the live demo, I'm just going to create a new policy, give it a name, and I'm going to set that I want to use snapshots again. And what you can do is we can obviously define how often we want to set these snapshots. Now, these are our local snapshots that we're going to take of those applications and store them locally to the Kubernetes cluster. We can specify that we want to change these, how often we want to keep them. Now, when we enable the offloading of the snapshots, we can actually define not only that backup target, which is our VBR target, but we can change the snapshot retention period. So we can have different retention periods for local snapshots to what we're having in our external backup repository as well. So we can see that there's different ones. Now, as I mentioned, we have different options when we want to create our backups, and we can pick a name, or we can use wildcards, or we can use labels. So for this, we're just going to use the MySQL star wildcard. So anything that has a label of MySQL, a namespace of MySQL, will get included in this policy. So we're going to run that, and we'll go to the dashboard, and we'll see not only the backup running, but we'll also see it start exporting as well. So we know that now that application is compliant. We can see down the bottom, the task is running that shows us that that backup has been performed. If we click on that, we see that we've taken a snapshot it's 1 gig in size, what the storage class name is, and all those different components, again, that make up that Kubernetes application that I've been talking about. So we see like our persistent volume claims at the bottom, our storage classes, the different services, the configuration maps, and so on, all included in that backup. Now, we see that our export has ran as well. So we have taken a snapshot, we've taken our backups, and we've exported and offloaded those to that Veeam backup and replication target. We see we have the same components, but we have that nice little VBR icon, same as what you saw in Melissa's demos, that showed that that is saved in the VBR environment. Now, if we go to Veeam backup and replication, everyone hopefully is familiar with this because you're all Veeam users. And we expand that backups, and we see that the Kubernetes backup is now a first-class citizen in the Veeam backup and replication. So we see that we have a Kubernetes backup. We see what the data size is, same as what we saw in Kasten, and that the backup size is 79 megs. So that's how much we're storing on that VBR. As you saw, as we right-clicked on that, we had a number of options. As we develop this, we'll be able to do that instant recovery over to vSphere integrated containers, or Tanzu, or whatever VMware is calling it today, and be able to recover that very quickly to our on-prem platform. So very simple, very easy to configure, but very powerful. Now, if I go back to my live demo, the restore has completed. So if I look at my applications, we have our TFD backup that is actually running. So if I go back here and I do a quick command to look at all my namespaces, we can see that that TFD backup is running over there. So as I showed earlier, we have this WordPress site running in AWS. I can type what I should get. There we are. So we actually can see now that we've performed that restore. There's our application that's been restored. And we now have this external IP address here. So if I just paste that into my web browser, there we are. If we match those two together, we can see that that one running there that I took a backup of, and that one over here is now running in Microsoft Azure. So very quickly, I showed you how easy you can take an application that's running in one cloud platform on the Azure, the Amazon Kubernetes, Elastic Kubernetes service, protected that, went over to a different cluster, quickly imported that, restored it into that cluster, and then because of that restore, it took all those application components that we talked about, deployed it, created the load balancers, got an external IP address from Microsoft Azure, and spun that workload up in a completely different platform in a different location. So that pretty much concludes the section that I had. I went through that a little bit quicker in the interest of time, but we have a few minutes left. So what I would like to do is just open it up for questions, see if you've got any questions for me on the Kasten integration, where we're going with it, or any questions for Rick, Melissa, and Kirsten as well before we close this out. But thank you very much.
Well, you guys definitely, you can pipe in with the questions, but we wanted to take this as an opportunity to really build an awareness. Again, back to that first thing of perception, right? This is something we're investing a lot in, the acquisition, the technology, the integration, all these things are falling into place well. So that's why this got a pretty significant part of the time. Even though we ran late, it bugs me. That's my fault because I get talking and joking and rhyming and stuff. But no, delegates, do you have any comments, questions on this? Is this is this the right way to go? Do you like what you see even at that level?
I certainly have questions about Kasten and future integrations with the Veeam software. I think that's, right now it's two separate interfaces. And if I have an application that's composed of Kubernetes and something outside of Kubernetes, say a database running on a virtual machine, I have to use what is effectively two separate products to protect that. So what's on the roadmap for better integrating these two separate products?
Yeah, great question. So yes, as you saw in the demo, they are two separate products. From a roadmap perspective, nothing we can really like announce around that or anything like that. But what I would say is, as you've seen with a lot of the Veeam backup for AWS integration into Veeam backup and replication, as you saw at the beginning, Veeam backup for Azure version 2 will have that Veeam backup and replication integration. It's a logical step that as we go forward and through time, more and more of these cloud native backup products will become integrated. So, you know, I touched on that utopia of the single pane of glass. So it would make logical sense to go down that road, but nothing that we can kind of announce today and say, yes, we're going to do this on this date. But yeah.
One thing I'd add to that, David and Ned, to your point, like if we were showing, and we will at Cloud Field Day, the Azure, Google, or AWS backups, there's going to be this dual persona. You can live cloud only too. Like right now, the Azure and AWS solutions, if you want to do that in the marketplace and consume Veeam technology there for the backups, you can do that. It don't have to have this hybrid approach. So I kind of foresee directionally, you're going to see this dual persona exist where cloud native, if we want just what you saw with Kasten, probably still going to be able to consume that. Same, because that's what we're doing over in Azure, AWS, and Google.
Yeah.
Great, thank you. Yeah, the biggest disparity I see right now with these products is containers are in their own world, on-prem is in its own world, and then there's a lot of SaaS offerings that are in their own separate world in terms of how I'm going to interact with my data protection solution. So anyway, any approach to unifying some of those tools and having a consistent experience across all of them is, I think, should be made a priority.
Yeah.
So we hear that consistently, Ned. And I'll go one step further and to say, there's things in motion, but it's just not, I don't have the clearance to share it here and now about that. But I'll give you one piece of, technology math, Ned. Our two newest products, Veeam Backup for AWS, Veeam Backup for Azure, were both written in Linux. And we didn't show that here, but they have a similar web UI to what Melissa had driven and shown. And when you think about this cloud scale, this different platforms and stuff, this is just part of a bigger direction. And I'll just leave it at that.
What's your favorite word, Rick? Consistency, consistency, consistency?
Yes, one bold, one italicized, and the other one all caps. That's right.